protocol to escort His Serene Highness. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Gabriel Boric Font, President of the Republic of Chile. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Gabriel Boric Font, the President of the Republic of Chile, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, distinguished representatives of the member states of the United Nations, we have the firm conviction that democracy is memory and future, and that's why in our country 9 days ago we commemorated 50 years since the coup d'etat of the 11th of September 1973, which violently split our coexistence, bringing death, persecution, pain, and misery to my nation. The images of the presidential palace La Moneda being bombed, the immolation of the democratically elected president of the country, Mr. Salvador Allende, and the self-evident truth that the then US government, headed by President Nixon, had conspired from the outset to promote the downfall of the Chilean government, touched the democratic conscience of the wider world. While some countries at that time were betting on instability of fragile and more robust democracies, there were international organizations such as the UN itself who played a fundamental role in defending human rights and democracy. Because from the very outset, they put it on the line to defend those who were suffering most, who were most vulnerable in Latin America and Chile and throughout the world. That is why the United Nations and several of the countries here today, we have a great debt of gratitude to you. There were thousands who provided support to the persecuted, who saved lives, and who showed solidarity, which up to today we continue to commemorate on behalf of the victims of the Pinochet regime. Since then, my country has covered a great distance. We've come a long way. As Chilean citizens, we feel proud that we have come together to recover our democracy, restore our republic, and return to the path of human rights and fundamental freedoms, which had been founded by the founding fathers of our democracy. Chile is a country which loves and promotes peace. That is our identity, and that is what we choose to carry forward. 50 years after the tragedy which I've just outlined, we have borne our pain, and we have done so via initiatives such as the Redditch and the Balic commissions and the Search Committee. But at the same time, Chile remains a country which is progressing because we've learned from the lessons of the past. We have analysed our past to build a better future, and it's through that learning that we can project ourselves into, we can see into the challenges of the future. One of those challenges where there is great agreement, having listened to the speeches which came before mine, is that the problems of democracy must be solved with more and never less democracy. A coup d'etat is never inevitable. Democracy always offers alternatives. We've also learned that human rights are an irrenounceable ethical basis in politics, and that human rights are of no individual party and must be defended in all places at all times, whatever the political colour of the government which undermines them. That is a principle which we have upheld and will continue to uphold, in particular as a member of the Human Rights Council. We have learned through our history that democracy is vulnerable, fragile, that it is not guaranteed forever, and therefore we must look out for it. That violence is not acceptable as a method of political action in democracy. That dialogue must always be the priority amongst those who have different views, and that applies also to relations between states. That is why I want to reiterate Chile's profound conviction and commitment to multilateralism and peaceful mechanisms for resolving conflicts. We have also learned, and I think it is important to highlight this at times of polarization, that when we manage to come together around shared goals, we can make progress in a shared and plural way to the benefit of all of our peoples. Because it's true to say, and you just have to follow the debates in my country to realize this, it's true that there are major differences of opinion in Chile today, but there are also major consensuses. And taken together, along with the four former presidents who are currently still alive, we have signed a firm commitment for the future of democracy and human rights in our country. And we invite other state leaders to join us in this effort. Even at the moments of most political turmoil, we are able to come together to seek ways out of our difficulties and which put our people ahead of our legitimate differences. That is why together, and I underscore this, together, both the government and the opposition are seeking paths forward to meet the demands of our people. The generations which came before us, ladies and gentlemen, assumed the responsibility of making our nations independent, of building democratic institutions, and creating leadership and universal human rights, and progressively moving forward on achieving social rights. My generation, which hadn't yet been born when the coup d'etat happened in 1973, it falls to us to consolidate and to enhance many of the achievements of the past at the same time as with optimism we tackle new threats and challenges ahead. Mr. President, distinguished members of the General Assembly, today there are three urgent tasks which I humbly today wish to bring to your attention and which my country thinks deserve our priority and which have already been mentioned by many in this General Assembly today. It is an urgent task, this is number one, that we look out for democracy, that we take care of it. We must put a stop to the advance of totalitarianism. We must be decisive in confronting disinformation, which is corroding our democracies from the inside. We must do it from an institutional and clear way. We must defend the rights of minorities, but also of those who are not minorities, who are in fact the majority, such as women, whose progress is threatened by various forms of totalitarianism and fanaticism. We must tackle the profound causes that are undermining our democracies. We are concerned that these vulnerabilities or the loss of democracy will take on new forms, not of the coup d'etats of the 20th century, but new forms in the 21st century, some of which may even have the sheen of majority to them. Democracy today is not satisfying all of the yearnings of people who urgently want and need security, greater equality, a way out of poverty. Democracy must be able to come up with results. We must pour all of our efforts into that. When institutions fail or are too slow in coming up with results, corruption and organised crime, various forms of inequality, all of these challenges which are corroding our institutions lead to a lack of trust among the people. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, looking after democracy means tackling the frustrations and the yearnings and the needs of our people. We have to channel them through the challenges which we face and make progress with shared action greater freedom, more prosperity, social justice, sustainability. We must always put the collective interest ahead of individual interests, and in particular of the individual interests of those who have the most power, including ourselves as the governing class. In this regard, we also call for the strict respect of human rights as a path forward, regardless of who is in government. And as I've already said in other international fora, I feel the obligation to denounce in front of this Assembly and the world the persecution that is brought against all those who have any different thoughts or ideas than those of the government of Mr. Ortega in Nicaragua, who's not only impeding involvement in elections, but is removing citizenship, imposing house arrest, and removing political rights. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, we have to come together to reflect on the fact that any solution to all of these problems must arrive via multilateral consensus. And we must understand that when unilateral sanctions are imposed, that is not contributing towards the solution. The case of the sanctions against Venezuela, for example, from our perspective today, are not contributing to improving the life circumstances of the population of Venezuela, and we are convinced that to ensure that there are free elections with all the necessary safeguards for all in Venezuela, it is essential that the United States lift the sanctions which it has now imposed on Venezuela. The same applies to the sanctions which have been in place for so very long against Cuba. I want to be very clear. Declaring that Cuba is a country which promotes terrorism is not just false, it is violent, it is brutal, and we would call on the United States to follow the line which was taken a few years ago by the government of Barack Obama when it took Cuba off of that list. These sanctions hurt not the government of Cuba but the people who don't deserve it. At the same time, I feel obliged to raise my voice when it comes to two conflicts which are tearing apart humanity and which come to us from two different times. Some of you legitimately will be wondering why Chile wishes to discuss conflicts which are happening in such far-flung parts of the world. It's because humanity as a whole is important to us, and we should not remain silent when we see the illegal, for example, the illegal occupation of Palestine and the inability of Palestine to form its own state and government, the wall which is enclosing its citizens. We must recognize the right to exist of both of those countries, Palestine and Israel, and that is why at this podium we call for the respect of international law. A more recent conflict now, where also we see ambiguities which tend to come out when these events happen, and we must clearly condemn, explicitly condemn, the illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine. On this point, it is our conviction that a conflict of this nature, of these characteristics, we cannot blame the invading government, the invading nation, in any way in the same way as the invaded nation. And we are convinced that peace can only be achieved by respecting the territorial integrity of nations. And we say that as a country which is a small or medium country, which is what we are, a country from the far south of the world. And we say it because we understand that countries such as ours depend on international law for our defence in potential future conflicts. Today it's Ukraine, in the future it could be any of us. And in this context, we can't close our eyes or look away. We cannot be ambiguous in condemning what, from our perspective, is a war of aggression, and a legal war of aggression at that. My second topic requiring urgent action now, where responsibility, again, does not fall on all of us in the same way, is the climate change crisis, pollution and loss of biodiversity. Here, the diagnostic is very clear. Almost all of the leaders at this rostrum have spoken on this topic. These are problems of today, not tomorrow. In my country, we faced it with forest fires and other disasters, and we know that many of you, particularly the most vulnerable, those who have contributed least to global warming, are the ones who have suffered the most. The ones who have burned the least fossil fuels are the ones suffering the most from this climate crisis. And that is why we make a call, as we did earlier this morning at the high-level panel on this topic, for rapid action to accelerate the transition, to change our consumption, to establish new rules which allow us to meet these demanding challenges. In my country, we've made progress in that direction under different governments with different leadership. We have 43% of protected marine areas and a very high percentage of terrestrial protected areas. We've set up a number of protected areas, and we've also made commitments whereby at the very latest by 2050 we will be climate neutral, if not before. However, climate change means that we are facing increasing and more complex challenges. Right now, it's a very severe drought, which, despite the rains of this year, which themselves brought problems, flooding in areas that were no longer used to such rains, and we've also had forest fires. We are suffering a wide range of phenomena which have a direct impact on the most vulnerable. We understand that the same problems are happening elsewhere in the world. For example, the major floods recently in Libya, which the Secretary General and the President both mentioned in their addresses yesterday. Last year in Pakistan, there was a drought. In Argentina, in the Horn of Africa, in Central America. These are just a few examples which should move us into action now. And that is why we need to do more. I would make a call on the countries with greatest industrial activity to assume their full responsibility, not just to be more environmentally respectful, but also to show greater solidarity with those who are suffering most, such as the small Pacific Island nations, who are suffering the effects of climate change. Also Central America and the Caribbean, they are suffering the devastating effects of climate change, a crisis which we had no hand in causing. In Chile, we are putting all of our weight behind environmental agreements and making huge efforts since last year, for example, for an agreement to protect the oceans. This year we signed the BBNJ Convention, and today before this Assembly I wish to reiterate our commitment and willingness for Valparaiso, the historic gateway to America, the Pearl of the Pacific, to become the headquarters of that treaty's secretariat. You can count on us for its proper development and to contribute to a more sustainable and fairer, more equitable development. Finally, the third challenge, which I think has to be a priority, relates to technological change, which can only be compared with the Industrial Revolution of the mid-18th century, which will change entirely the way that we think, that we relate, that we produce, that we work. Only a few weeks ago, we saw in a small town in Spain how a few hours ago, in fact, how a mother had to report to the police how a group of boys at school had taken images of her daughter and, using artificial intelligence, created pornographic images of her daughter and distributed them. The world is changing. People have a right to privacy, to their integrity. All changes in technology throughout the history of humanity have been a major opportunity to create fairer societies. But if we get it wrong, they can also be sources of new injustice. And in this context, it is the obligation of all to create multilateral consensus, to create a ethical framework for the development and use of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. We need a framework which takes the human rights perspective into account in the research and development of new technologies in order to protect and foment the dignity and the rights of peoples and individuals. Societies must make progress, there can be no doubt, but we have to do it in a responsible way. That is why understanding and better managing the opportunities of new technologies to put it to use for our benefit before it becomes a threat is so important. And I would conclude by saying that this is an obligation. And it is what we've been doing in Chile since the Congress on the Future, which I am absolutely sure you all have initiatives of a similar nature in your country. With humility, but with pride, I can state here today that my country can stand as a Latin American reference for the future of artificial intelligence, and we are going to work tirelessly in that responsible direction. Democracy, as I said, is memory, but it is also future, and that's why we think that technological development has to be a tool for unity, not division. It has to promote the empowerment of all of society. We must tackle the phenomenon of disinformation, which is brought to bear in particular against the most vulnerable in society. We must ensure that it does not drive us further apart, both within our countries and at the international level. I conclude by saying that the challenges we face require audacious and collective solutions, because none of us, even the most powerful country in the world, can tackle these challenges in isolation. The phenomena of the climate crisis, migration, pandemics, no borders, no flags. They affect all countries of the world. And that is why this forum, this General Assembly, must stand up to these challenges. We must rise to the occasion. We must show that we are more than just empty words and more than the speech made yesterday by the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. We must reform global governance, both in its political aspects as well as financial. It is reform or the descent into barbarism. We stand for reform, and we can tell the Secretary General that he has our support, not just in reforming the Security Council, but also the financial institutions that were born out of the Bretton Woods Consensus. I underscore, democracy is memory and future, and on the path to a better world, the role of this General Assembly will be decisive. That is why, and because we've learned from our past, and as a representative of a new generation, I am optimistic about what is yet to come in our future. This General Assembly, throughout its more than 70 years of history, has shown that even in the most difficult times, it is possible for humanity to strike agreements on the path towards civilized cooperation and coexistence. Distinguished delegates, you will always be able to count on Chile to promote and to defend human rights, multilateralism, democracy, and together to build a sustainable future and a world free of poverty which has greater social equality. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Chile for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency,